Hello and welcome to this tutorial from Pro Photo Vector. My name is Mike Davies, and in this tutorial I'll be quickly showing you how to edit a raw photo from start to finish inside of Affinity Photo. If you're looking for a more in-depth look at every single step in this process, I recommend checking out my How to Edit Raw Photos in Affinity Photo course, which I'll link to the description of this video. So for starters, we'll go to File, Open, or Open Recent. And I'm just going to go with this first file here, which is a CR2 file that is a raw file format. And by opening up a raw image, we are opening Affinity Photo into the develop persona, so that will happen by default. And because we're inside of the develop persona, we have a new set of icons in the toolbar. I'm going to set this to the mirror view here. That's going to give us an after view on the left and the before view on the right. So everything that we do on our photo in terms of editing is going to happen on the left side here. I also like to make sure that the clipping is turned on for the highlights, shadows, and the tones. And that's just giving us a guide anytime our colors are out of gamut or being clipped. And I also like to eyeball the histogram as I work. This is just giving us a distribution of the colors for the red, green, and blue channels. Obviously red's here, blue's here. And let's start off here in the basic tab. So let's scroll up to the top. This says raw edit preset. This is actually just the default because there are no changes on here. But I'll start with the exposure, and that's going to increase the amount of light that's displaying in our photo. And I like to increase this by a full stop, and I like this to be even, so I'll just manually type in 1.0. You'll see all of the colors in our histogram shifting as we brighten this up. Next is the black point, so that is just going to change how many black pixels are in the image. As I increase it, it's adding more black pixels. That's just helping to add some contrast and help even out the lighting. And finally, the brightness is like a more nuanced version of exposure. So when we increase the brightness, the photo will get a little brighter overall. So because we've increased the brightness more than we've decreased it, it has sort of made the image look flat. What we can do to fix that is next in the Enhance section. So here we have the contrast slider. That's going to darken the darker pixels and brighten the brighter pixels, which will add contrast, and that in turn adds a bit more depth. And then next is the clarity slider. This is similar to the contrast slider, except the clarity is going to work at the edge details of items in our image or objects in our image. So that's just going to help sharpen everything while also adding a bit more contrast. If you add too much contrast, it's going to darken the photo. So it's good to find a pretty good balance. And this looks fine for now. We will probably come back and adjust all these later, just tweak things. But next up is saturation. So this is going to increase the intensity of all the colors across the entire image. We don't want to do that too much because we have the Vibrance slider, which also works on the saturation, except this is going to preserve the skin tones. So this helps the skin tones from looking too overly saturated, which in this case it still sort of does. So I'll decrease this a bit. So there we have the Vibrance turned up. Next is the white balance. This allows us to adjust the temperature. So if we add blue to this, it's going to cool it down. And if we add yellow to it, it'll warm it up. Because the lighting in here is probably fluorescent, we can cool this down a bit. And that's going to give us a better tone there, or better overall color. And then tint is going to allow us to either add magenta or green to this. I think a bit more magenta is in order for this image. Finally, we have the shadows and highlights. This allows us to either increase or decrease the shadow pixels, the brightness of the shadow pixels, or increase or decrease the brightness of the highlight pixels. Typically what you're going to do is decrease the highlights and increase the shadows. That's going to help balance the lighting out a bit better, and it'll help recover details in those areas of the image. And don't worry about the clipping still occurring here. These are going to be clipped highlights as well as clipped tones. Same within the glasses there. We will fix that in a later step. I'll skip over the profiles for now. That's just if you need to output this to a specific color profile, which is not super common unless you're printing. But I'll move on to the lens here, the lens tab or the lens panel, and this is going to use the profile from the lens that was used in the photo. So here you can see we used a Canon EF 50mm f1.8, and you can manually adjust this if you want, but I don't recommend it. So next is the chromatic aberration. That's going to be if you see a misalignment in the red, green, and blue color channels, which I don't particularly see in this image, so I'm just going to leave that. You could check it, and that will just automatically apply corrections and see if it makes your image look better. In my case, I'm going to leave it unchecked. But the defringe option is another option. So here you can see there's a bit of fringing happening between these high contrast areas. We have the black hat and then the bright white lights here. That's created this sort of tealish purple fringe. So that's what that's going to get rid of. So I'll check that. And we can scroll down. The hue slider allows us to select the hue of the fringe itself. So we do have a bit of a teal color going on. So I'm going to drag the hue to that teal color. The radius is going to allow me to change the size of the area affected. It looks like this is fine for now. There's not residual teal still showing up. Tolerance allows you to choose how close the color has to be inside the fringing area to the color you have selected. We can turn this up if we still see some areas of teal showing through. That way it's going to also grab some areas that are not teal. But in this case, it's not too bad, and I'll leave the threshold the same as well. I'll hold Control and zoom out with my mouse wheel. The remove lens vignette will be turned on by default, so the lens is going to naturally create a darkening around the edges of the photograph. This will compensate for that by brightening those areas. You can leave that off if you like having a vignette. In this case, it doesn't look too terrible, but I will leave it on just for now. Post-crop vignetting is going to be most similar to using a vignette tool. There is a vignette tool inside of the photo persona of Affinity Photo. This is most similar to that. I recommend saving that step towards the end, so I'm going to leave this unchecked for now. And we're going to move on to the details. So here we have detail refinement. This allows you to sharpen. Increasing the radius increases the area that you want to sharpen, while increasing the amount is going to increase the contrast in that area, in those areas, I should say, where the sharpening occurs, which once again is going to be the edge details. So really anywhere where the software detects an edge, it's going to apply details. That can be like the edge of the glasses, the hair, the frame of the body, etc. I don't recommend turning these values up too much because it can start to pull things out of, for example, the tonal range, or pull clipped highlights out and make them even worse. Next, you have noise reduction. So I'll hold Control, zoom in. In this photo, we have a decent amount of noise right here. So the noise reduction allows you to smooth that out. Luminance noise is going to occur whenever you have pixels that are assigned to the wrong brightness. So maybe a pixel is too bright or a pixel is too dark. When you have a lot of instances of that, it creates a grainy or a noisy looking image. So here you can see by turning up the luminance, it's smoothed that out quite significantly compared to the original. You don't want to turn this up too much though, because it can smooth out important details in the photo. So you typically want to play around with the luminance to turn up or down the intensity of the smoothing. Luminance details is going to allow the original details of the image to come through, even with the smoothing going on. I'm going to keep that set to the default. Luminance contribution is like the strength of the overall effect across the entire image. So if you think it's a bit too strong, you can turn it down with the slider here, and that's sort of like turning down the opacity on an effect. In this case, I'll keep it turned up. Colors is for color noise, so luminance noise has to do with the pixels being assigned the wrong brightness. Color noise has to do with pixels being assigned the wrong color. If I turn this all the way down, you'll see what happens. You'll start to see some small color artifacts here. It's not too terrible in this image, especially since we have luminance turned up as well. So if I turn off all the noise reduction, you can see some luminance and color noise in here. So let's turn this back up to 20. And we'll turn the color noise up to 20 as well. Probably don't need it that high. And once again, the colors contribution allows you to decrease that effect if you feel it's too strong. In this case, let's see, it's probably not a huge deal. We could probably turn it down a little bit because there's not a ton of color noise going on. The final section of the details panel is noise addition. That's if you want to artificially add noise into the photograph, make it look grainy on purpose. I don't want to do that here, so I'm going to skip that, and we'll come over here to the tones. So the tones panel allows you to adjust the tonal values of the image. That's going to start with the curves area, which is basically just a tone curve. So I'll check that option to enable the tone curve. So we're going to start in the master, which is going to be the composite image, or in other words, all three color channels combined on the same channel. And this just allows us to basically adjust the brightness and contrast. One thing I like to do for starters, especially since I have some clipped areas and some clipped tonal areas, is I can just adjust this top portion here to bring down those clipped highlights and adjust the bottom portion here, which is actually the black point. This is the white point. And this just allows us to adjust out those clipping of the tonal values that are being clipped and the highlight values that are being clipped. So now you can see there are no warnings about anything being clipped, and we can continue by clicking on the curve and dragging this node up. So these little spots on the curve are called nodes. If you ever want to delete them, you can click on them and hit the backspace key. So I'll click and drag this upwards. That's going to increase the brightness value of any of the pixels that are above the original diagonal line here. So this diagonal plane. Everything up here is increased, and the further away the curve is from that diagonal line, the more of an increase there's going to be in the brightness value. If you go the other way, that's going to be a decrease in that brightness value. So for example, right now you can see the midtones are increased significantly versus the shadows are only increased slightly. If I wanted to add contrast, I can click and drag towards the other end and drag it the opposite way. So what that's going to do is it's going to decrease the brightness of the shadow pixels. And if we do that too much, it's going to take away too much detail in the photo. But that's going to create what's called an S-curve, and S-curves are going to create contrast. You could tweak the S-curve based on how you want this to look, but there we have a decent amount of brightness and contrast. Moving on to the other channels, you have your red, green, and just off of the screen you have the blue channel. So when you're adjusting these with the tone curve, it's going to be more like performing a general color correction. And instead of adding brightness or decreasing brightness, we're actually adding red saturation to this area of the image, which is the highlights in the top right, shadows in the bottom left, and midtones in the center. So we're either adding red saturation or adding cyan saturation. So in this case, the image has maybe a bit too much red, so I can add just a tiny bit of saturation there, cyan saturation, and maybe we want to either add more saturation to the shadows or to add some color contrast, maybe just add a touch of red to the shadows, like so. Let's move on to the green channel, and I think this part is going to be subjective, the most subjective part for all of you, because you're going to want to make the colors however you want to make them based on your artistic eye and your artistic style. But here we can add some green to the highlights and maybe magenta to the shadows. So we're either adding green or adding magenta saturation. And we can always adjust the top and bottom here. And finally, I'll move on to blue, and don't worry if this doesn't look great to you guys right now. We're going to make some additional tweaks after this. So we can add some blue to the highlights, maybe add yellow to the shadows. You don't always have to counteract the colors. You might just want to add both, more of both colors to the shadows and the highlights. But there's a before, there is an after. And I'm just going to make some further tweaks. And I'm also going to change the preview option to the split view. So there you can see that's the after, that's the before. And it looks pretty good. I'm just going to make some minor tweaks here. And we can also read the histogram to see how the changes are affecting the distribution there overall. But I like to more so for this part go with just the eye test. See what looks best to the eye. All right, that's fine for now. Let's switch back to the mirror view. And I'm going to come back to the basic tab. I'm going to play around with the temperature. I think it's a bit too on the yellow side, the image overall, and decrease the vibrance. Also tweak the saturation down. So that looks a bit more natural there. Let's come back to the tones and scroll down. So black and white is for black and white photo editing. I don't want to use that right now. I'll come over to split toning and turn that on. This allows you to add a color saturation to the highlights and then add a different color saturation to the shadows. And you could choose what color you'd like to add. So for example, you can go with orange and teal, which is a pretty common color combination. So we've adjusted the highlights hue to orange, the shadows to teal, and then we can crank up the saturation for that color in that area of the image. So we'll increase the highlight saturation, increase the shadow saturation, and then you can come down here to balance and play around with how much of the colors are going to be in each. So this, if we go to the left, is going to add more orange, and if we go to the right, it'll add more teal. So you can find the balance based on the look you like. Go with about right there. So now I'm going to come back to the basic tab and just tweak these before I get into the final section of this. All right, so we pretty much have our edits on here. The next thing I'm going to do is use what's called an overlay, and overlays are essentially layer masks that you can paint on your raw images and then use those layer masks to only make adjustments to those overlay areas. So I'm going to come over here to the Overlays tab, and you'll see we have a little brush here. We also have a tool over here. So this is the Overlay Paint tool. And what I can do is either grab the brush here or down here inside the Overlays tab. And let's say, for example, I just want to brighten the face of the subject here, of our model. So I can paint on the face area like so. Now when I come over to the Basic tab, for example, and start tweaking, you'll see that the tweaks will only affect the face. So for example, when I start turning up the exposure, you'll see that that exposure will only affect the area I painted. I don't want to overdo this because it'll look terrible. So we'll just increase the exposure slightly. We're still on the overlay layer and we still have the paint tool selected. So if I decided I wanted to increase the overlay area and just start to paint other areas where I want there to be an increase in exposure, I can just paint, for example, the body of the model here. And that's going to expand that overlay area. So now all these areas that I painted will include that increase in exposure, but everything else will not contain that. So let me hit Control Z though, because I don't like that look. And let's go with one last example. So we'll come back to the overlays. We're going to click to add another brush overlay. So that's basically like adding an overlay layer. This time I'm going to paint around the hat. So let's say, for example, we wanted to get rid of some of that blue that was in the hat. And come back here to the Basic tab. I can, for example, turn down the saturation, and that will remove some of the colors that are up there inside the hat, if that's what we want to do. Let me just increase this a bit. I don't want to do it too much. So once we've done that, we can go back to the original overlay, so the master overlay, and from there we can continue making edits if we need to, or we can just finish up and be done with it. So lastly, let's say we wanted to crop this and then add a vignette. I can come over here to the crop tool inside of my tools panel there and just decrease the size of this and then double click inside. So that will crop the image. And finally, I'll come back to the lens panel, scroll down to post crop vignette and check that option. So here we can increase the intensity. So there, that's going to darken the photo. The scale is going to increase the size of that inner circle. So let's drag this to the right so that the vignette doesn't go as far into the middle of the photo. And then the hardness is going to make the vignette less soft. So that's going to take out some of the black that's encroaching upon the middle there. So here's a before, here's an after. And by the way, I do have an entire tutorial dedicated to the vignette tool inside of Affinity Photo, so definitely check that out. So if you wanted to, you could do one last comparison. Let's do the split view. And you can see the before on the right, the after on the left. And if you're happy with that, come over here and click Develop. That will develop your image and open it up into Affinity's photo persona. And from here, you can use any of the photo editing or manipulation tools. I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can go to File and Save or Save As. And you can see I've edited this a few times, so I'll just add another edit to this, edit 4. That'll save this as an Affinity file. So I'll click save. That allows us to open this back up, basically where we left off, and continue our session if we wanted to make additional photo edits or manipulations. All right, so that's it for this tutorial. Again, if you want a more in-depth look at each of the settings found inside of the Develop persona, I recommend checking out my Affinity Photo course linked in the description of the video. Otherwise, if you like this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel for more Affinity Photo tutorials. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.